Us tonight for this presentation sponsored by Friends of Sears Island and the Belfast Free Library. As Brenda said, I'm Ashley McGuire. I'm the Outreach Coordinator for Friends of Sears Island. Our organization is the land manager for the 601-acre conservation area on Sears Island in Searsport, and we maintain public accessibility and act as stewards of the land, as well as offering a wide array of educational programs to the public. And I'm sure many of you joining us tonight are aware of the plastic spill that took place in early December that resulted in 2 bales, which was 6,000 pounds of compressed small plastic pieces falling into Penobscot Bay. Shortly thereafter, many tiny pieces of plastic and clumps of the bale washed onto the western shore of Sears Island, getting tangled in the seaweed as the tides went in and out and making it very difficult to remove. Many people graciously volunteered their time to help clean up the beach, but the going was slow and fairly inefficient. This was the first plastic spill like this in Maine, and Friends of Sears Island has been working with many different groups over the past month to determine the most efficient way to clean up the plastic, as well as to ensure that measures are taken to avoid this happening again in the future. We had actually planned to co-host this talk with the Belfast Free Library well before this plastic spill happened, because we thought it would be an interesting and important topic. But we had no idea how timely it would end up being and how relevant to Sears Island and the surrounding area. Abby Barrows has actually ended up consulting with Friends of Sears Island and the DEP on the plastic spill to lend her expertise and to discuss more efficient cleanup methods and monitoring and things like that. And while she'll mainly be talking tonight about the complex problem of microplastic pollution, sort of in the broader sense, and discussing her research, we will have a brief question and answer period at the end of her presentation. So if you have questions related to the Sears Island plastic spill, several Friends of Sears Island board members are on the call this evening, including Susan White, our board president, and Rolf Olson, our vice president. And so between all of us, we'll do our best to answer any questions that you may have specific to that situation. Lastly, if you're interested in learning more about all the good work that our group is doing, you can visit our website and Facebook page. And if you find value in our programming, we always encourage you to consider becoming a member. Our organization relies heavily on donations and grants to carry out our mission and continue to offer free public programming. So now I'd like to introduce Abby. During directing microplastics research since 2012, Abby has initiated the first baseline data map of microplastic pollution distribution in Maine. She recently concluded work as the principal investigator for the Global Microplastics Initiative and Adventure Scientists, where they compiled one of the largest global data sets on every ocean and continent in the world, enabling a rare glimpse at the extent of plastic contamination in remote, understudied ocean and fresh waters. She's also an oyster farmer on Deer Isle, where she lives. So thank you, Abby, for taking the time to be here tonight and give this presentation, and we'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you everyone for joining us on a Thursday evening and your interest in this topic. I'm going to share my screen and get started. All right. Can everyone see that okay? All right. All right. So my name is Abigail Barrows, and I'm a research associate with the College of the Atlantic, and I work as a
Hey, Josh, this is a 20-minute warning.
Research consultant. I'm going to talk about plastic pollution in general, and then my research pertaining to microplastic pollution. So the first fully synthetic plastic was Bakelite, and it was invented in 1907 by Leo Baekeland, and he coined the term plastic. New plastic has been invented every decade since, and most plastic that we use for just a few minutes before we throw it away. This graph shows the cumulative production of plastic by the millions of tons every decade since the 1950s, when it really came into household use. So each line when it turns into dotted lines is showing sort of the projection into the future based on our current trends. So the black line shows the primary waste that has been generated. The red line shows all the waste that has been discarded. And the green line shows all the waste that has been burned. And the blue line shows all the waste that has been recycled. We are globally producing around 360 million tons each year. And although I think this year it's going to be a lot higher with all of the PPE, but that's expected to double in the next 5 years and more than triple by 2050. As of 2016, about 80% of all the plastic made was accumulated in landfills or in the natural environment. This diagram comes from a study that just came out in Science magazine by a woman who actually lives in southern Maine. And this is based on data from 2016 because that's the most recent data available globally and in the US. So this illustrates the plastic waste generation in the US and the estimated mass of plastic waste that was mismanaged domestically by littering and illegal dumping, and also abroad during processing of material collected for recycling. About 5% of post-consumer plastic is recycled in the US, and we are the second largest exporter of plastic scrap globally. It's often sent to countries that cannot adequately manage plastic waste. And globally, approximately half of the plastic waste collected for recycling is traded internationally. So it's not surprising that images such as these are becoming common sights around the world. It's estimated that 8 million tons of plastic pollution come from land and about 2.5 million tons come from rivers. So it's not just a coastal issue. So to visualize that, that's about 5 grocery bags of trash on every foot of coastline around the globe. And by 2025, those 5 grocery bags of plastic are going to be 10 bags. And if we continue on our current trend of production and mismanagement, it's projected that plastic will outweigh the fish in the ocean by 2050. These maps show model predictions of global plastic pollution density in our oceans, and were put together by a colleague of mine about 7 years ago. Each map shows the different size classes of plastic with a plastic size range in the bottom left-hand corner. The color bar on the right shows how many pieces per square kilometer, with the dark red representing the highest density. The top 2 maps show microplastic distribution. The bottom left shows mesoplastic, and the bottom right shows macroplastic. It's estimated that there are between 15 and 50 trillion plastic pieces weighing over 250 tons afloat in our oceans. And as you can see, the dominant pollutant size classes are on the microplastic scale. Every aquatic habitat that's been researched has contained plastic. So what are microplastics? They are a pollutant that has emerged as an issue of international concern. They're defined as having a size between 1 micron and 5 millimeters, although there has been some debate around that size class. I'm not even going to talk about nanoplastics today, but that is a whole new field of research that's just starting up. It's really important to think of microplastics as a suite or a class of contaminants, because microplastics are diverse. They come from many different products and polymer types, but they have the shared characteristics of being non-biodegradable. They absorb and release chemicals. They fragment, but they don't disappear. They come in different shapes, sizes, and colors. And microfibers are the most common shape that is found. Microplastics have been found in all of the world's oceans, from the surface to the deepest ocean trenches, the Mariana Trench. They've been found in fresh water, tap water, bottled water, our beverages, honey, table salt, seafood, birds, our air, and most recently, as of last week, we've been finding them in human placentas. So the more places we look, the more places we find this pollutant. So microplastics are divided into 2 categories, and each have sort of different regulatory aspects. The primary microplastics are nurdles, which are a pre-production plastic resin pellet. They're these tiny little things. I don't know if anyone spends time on the West Coast, but you often find them on the sand there, sort of in the rack line. These are transported around the world to manufacturing sites where they're melted and molded into the final products that we all use every day. Microbeads are these small spheres that are added into personal care products such as face wash or toothpaste as an exfoliant or a filler. These have now been banned in a lot of different countries, including here in the US, but they still make their way into some leave-on products because of some loopholes in the legislation. The primary microplastics directly enter the environment through spills, in the case of nurdles, or through our waste, our household wastewater. Secondary microplastics are the predominant type of pollution that we find. And these are small pieces of plastic that come from larger pieces fragmenting over size, such as bottles, bags, tires, textiles, through mechanical and chemical degradation. A huge contributor to secondary microplastics appear to be our clothing. So each time we wear or wash or dry our synthetics, they shed into the environment, both in the water and the air. And each washing machine cycle can release thousands of microfibers. That's resulting in an estimated 500,000 tons of microplastics from synthetic clothing ending up in the sea every year. And also a colleague of mine just did a study in Vermont and looking at her dryer lint, and that is also a major contributor of household plastic. So how do they get into the environment? The point and non-point sources of microplastics are similar to other pollutants, but especially noteworthy sources are tire dust, which are fragments, and from our wastewater, which are mostly microfibers. Tire and road wear particles are emitted into the environment by the thousands of tons each year. We all have to replace our car tires every few years. Where do you think that all goes? So depending, and so that often is just through runoff. And depending on the design of a wastewater treatment plant, they can be a major source of microfibers from domestic washing through the filters not being small enough to capture those fibers before they get put into the water. Also the sludge from wastewater treatment plants. So the sludge is often landfilled or land applied, and it can contain really high numbers of microplastics and microfibers. And when it's land applied, it can get into the groundwater, run off into the watershed, or potentially become airborne. And two other sources that are just beginning to be studied of microplastics and microfibers in our environment in particular are airborne microfibers that are shed while we walk around and wear our synthetic clothing and our outdoor gear. And the other potentially significant source of microfiber pollution are cigarette filters, but their contribution is still sort of yet to be quantified. So why do we care about this? Other than it's gross that there's a lot of plastic in our environment, in the aquatic environment, there are many ambient toxicants. And most of these are known as the persistent organic pollutants, or POPs. These are compounds that are resistant to environmental degradation. And the physical and chemical properties of plastic facilitates attraction and concentration of these chemicals, sometimes up to 1 million magnitudes higher than the surrounding seawater. Plastics also release the hazardous additives that they're made with into the environment. All of these chemicals have known negative human and environmental health effects. So this tiny, seemingly insignificant piece of plastic can become a toxic sponge, transporting POPs and their associated additives around the world and into different habitats and animals. So unfortunately, when plastics are consumed, either directly out of the environment or indirectly through consuming a prey that contains plastic, toxins from and on plastic can leach into the animal and find a permanent place in the food web. We've also discovered that microplastics can move through the blood-membrane barrier and enter into different body systems, as highlighted by that recent study about the placenta. Studies have shown associated behavior changes, reduced reproduction, energy uptake, and diminished offspring performance in animals that have ingested microplastics. Ingestion can have long-term individual, population, and community level impacts that we're still just beginning to understand. We know that we are eating and breathing them in, about a pound a year. And they've boiled that down to about a credit card's worth of plastic each week we're all eating or breathing in. The impacts of environmental exposure to microplastics on mortality and morbidity and the reproductive success of species continues to be investigated. But ultimately, this is really concerning because we don't still really understand the effects. So to put this into a more local context, you probably don't want it in a more local context. Back in 2015, I did a food web study with it's now called the Shaw Institute in Blue Hill. We analyzed 51 mussels, both rope grown and wild, oysters, clams, lobsters, and mackerel. And we found microplastics in 96% of the seafood samples. On average, we found 2.5 pieces of plastic per gram of tissue, and the lobster and mackerel contains more of the larger microplastics, so closer to the 5 millimeter size than the bivalves. So although microplastics research has been a really fast moving field and grown exponentially in the last 7 years, there continues to be a lot of questions. So one of the steps in furthering my understanding was looking at how we collected and quantified microplastics in the marine environment. So I conducted a field comparison study on 2 different sampling techniques. The paper demonstrates that the traditional and more often used technique for sampling microplastics, the surface plankton net, gave a density estimate for microplastics that was 3 orders of magnitude lower than using the grab sample technique, just a bottle of water, scooping up a bottle of water. So relying solely on the Newton samples would have resulted in a gross underestimation of the amount of microplastics in the sea surface in Blue Hill Bay. Also, the grab sample technique easily lends itself to citizen science because it's easy to build in quality control measures, which is really important in microplastic sampling, has a simple protocol, and the equipment is affordable. So now that I had a solid methodology, I want to learn more about the sources, composition, distribution of microplastic pollution in oceans, rivers, lakes, and streams. So in 2013, I approached and partnered with Adventure Scientists, a nonprofit organization based in Bozeman, Montana, and we launched the Global Marine Microplastics Initiative. In 2015, we expanded into global freshwater environments because at that time there was no research that had been conducted in freshwater. And we also began a 2-year study in the Gallatin watershed in Montana, which feeds into the Missouri and Mississippi rivers. They primarily managed the citizen scientists, and I ran all other aspects of the project out of a lab here in Stonington. At the project's conclusion, we made a short video that will explain more about the organization and the project. So I hope this works for you all.
5 years ago, we scooped up a half liter of water locally, brought it back to the Institute, looking under the microscope and seeing all these technicolor pieces of plastic led me to think of all of these larger questions. How is it affecting the ocean? Our drinking water? Are microplastics everywhere? But I couldn't answer those on my own. So this is when I partnered with Adventure Scientists. Adventure Scientists is a nonprofit organization that unites explorers and scientists to solve some of the world's most pressing environmental issues in which access to data is crucial to resolving them. I worked with Adventure Scientists to train adventurers who would be collecting data for me around the world. I'm about to take a microplastic sample. Able to get water samples from the Antarctic and the middle of the Pacific. We're going to send this into the labs. Through the process of working with Adventure Scientists, I was getting closer to understanding the magnitude of this issue. After analyzing thousands of samples from around the world, we concluded that 74% of them contain microplastic pollution. Microplastics are one of the largest pollution problems that you've never seen. Without Adventure Scientists, I would have never been able to even dream about this breadth of data that I've been able to collect. The Adventure Scientist model lends itself to so many different projects, whether it be microplastics or forestry conservation or animal protection. This is just the beginning.
Great. And so at the end of the project, based on survey results, 80% of our volunteers have taken steps to address plastic or microplastic pollution in their communities, and we're really proud of that. Oops. So just a little bit about the research I did with Adventure Scientists. This map shows where all the 1 liter grab samples were collected. So each point on the map shows where an adventurer was dangling out of a boat or a kayak and or wading into a stream and collecting that sample and then shipping it to my lab. So the bubbles, the orange bubbles show samples that contain plastic, and the size of the bubble indicates how much, the larger the bubble, the more plastic was found in that sample. The yellow bubbles are samples that did not contain plastic, which is always good for quality control. In total, we collected almost 2,500 samples globally. About 1,400 of those were in the marine environment and the rest were in fresh water. We found about 12 pieces of plastic on average in the ocean samples and only about 1.5 pieces in the freshwater samples. Across the board, about 90% of those microplastics were quantified as microfibers. The majority of those were invisible to the naked eye, so less than 1.5 millimeters in size, which is a smaller size than those captured in the majority of surface studies. A lot has to do with that grab sampling technique versus the Houston tow technique. So we produced this publication, which covered 5 years of marine research conducted in partnership with Adventure Scientists. And it was really important for me to have the data peer reviewed and published in order to validate the research in the wider world and increase its impact. All of the data that we collected with Adventure Scientists is open source through their website, as are the lab and field methods that I developed. So for the marine findings in brief, we collected, as I said, about 1,400 samples from every ocean on the planet, including coastal environments and understudied ocean regions. The data show that the microplastic concentration is higher in the open ocean than the coastal environments, with the highest concentrations found in the polar oceans. This was then further validated by other studies where we're seeing that the polar regions are acting as plastic sinks for microplastics. As you can see, the samples are spatially really diverse, and that's the kind of crazy thing about sampling in water or the ocean. You might go back and have a totally different result from the same piece of water. But I also found it really interesting that the coastal environments, even in very urban environments, we weren't seeing that those plastics were being moved and then trapped in some of the large gyres out in the open ocean. To highlight that, this is a sample that was taken in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. I don't have scale bars on this, unfortunately, but one side of the grid is about 3.2 millimeters in size, to give you an idea. And this is just a tangle mass of microfibers. They'd been sailing for days and had many days ahead of them before they hit land. And it's just pretty crazy to think of this out in the middle of the ocean. So to focus on the Gulf of Maine, we only had coastal samples, but the Gulf of Maine had the second highest amount of plastic of any region in the Atlantic Ocean. The Caribbean was the first. On average, we had 8 pieces of plastic per liter of water. 96% of those were microfibers. In the freshwater, we didn't get that many freshwater samples, and actually I took most of those. We found an average of half a piece of plastic per liter of water, and 100% of those were microfibers. So very likely that a lot of those were transported via wind. I also did a little work with Friends of Casco Bay, and they collected around 30 samples over a summer season, and they had a fairly low average of about half a piece of plastic per liter of water from those marine samples. In 2016, I joined an expedition mapping microplastics in the Hudson River from the headwaters to Ambrose Light in Long Island Sound. We collected 142 samples, and we have an average of 1 microplastic per liter of water. And subsequent material characterization, so figuring out what we were actually looking at, showed that half of the fibers were plastic, while the other half were non-plastic, but of anthropogenic origin. This is actually now being reflected in studies worldwide. We're seeing cotton and wool has made its way out into the ocean and into water samples as well. This might be because of some of the coatings and dyes makes them a little bit more resilient. So this is a heat map of all the sampling locations and the average microfibers found at each place that we sampled. Interestingly, there was no relationship between fiber abundance, wastewater treatment plant location, or population density. So, but we did discover that the Hudson River's watershed drainage area contributes an average of 300 million anthropogenic microfibers into the Atlantic Ocean every day. I also did a small study on plastic contamination in bottled drinking water for the nonprofit Story of Stuff. I looked at 19 different brands, or they were shipped to me from all over the country, just taken off the supermarket shelf. And 18 of the 19 brands contained plastic particles with an average of 8 pieces of plastic per bottle of water. Shortly after, a larger international study was done looking at bottled water over 9 different countries, and they had almost 300 different samples. They found microplastics in 93% of the bottled water, and they had an average of 10 microplastics per liter of water. And one brand contained over 10,000 pieces. So since then, more studies have occurred, and it's basically projected that bottled water contains about 22 times more plastic than tap water. Another reason not to buy bottled water. So now what? Complex problems need complex solutions, but maybe this isn't very complicated. Plastic is a material invented to last forever, and it can no longer be used to make products intended to be thrown away, because we know there is no way. If we make less and use less, then we'll have less pollution. We've begun to see legislation across the world and nation pertaining to single-use plastic reduction. Here in Maine, some of our styrofoam ban and bag ban has been enacted, but well, it's been pushed back until the summer, unfortunately. But it's a good start. And we need to go further and think about implementing strategies such as extended producer responsibility, or EPR, and the circular economy model. So upcoming legislation in Maine, there's an EPR bill focused on package recycling, and act to support the increase of recycling packaging. And in Washington State, a full EPR bill is now live as of January 1st, meaning that producers pay for the entire program for all the materials, including the plastic, paper, metal, and glass, and features including recycling targets, reuse targets, recycled content requirements, toxics, social equity, and transparency. So that's exciting news to see that happening here in the States, because up until this year, our only EPR that we had was the bottle bill. Also in Congress, there should be some upcoming legislation on called Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, and there's another EPR bill. In Europe, EPR programs for packaging have existed for decades with high success in reducing packaging and waste. But we know that plastic use isn't going to stop tomorrow, so we need to think about upstream solutions. This isn't only a waste management issue, it's a materials and consumption issue. So for us here in Maine, our ocean supports multiple active commercial fisheries, and fishing debris is commonly observed. So policies relevant to incentivizing the return of fishing gear may be most relevant for us here. Generally, local knowledge and long-term monitoring strategies are critical to inform effective local solutions. So in the meantime, there are a few tools out there to help us physically remove plastics from the environment before they enter the open ocean. So at the top here, we have some trash traps that remove some of the larger plastics. We have the trash wheel. I don't know if anyone's been down in Baltimore on the Anacostia River. He has quite a Twitter following, I think, this Mr. Trash Wheel. There's a trash boom that then feeds plastic trash up into this wheel, and it's very successful in removing many tons of plastic from entering the ocean every year. On the medium scale, we have the waste shark, which is this little ROV type thing that can scoop up plastic. The sea bin is a really awesome technology, and I'd love to see some of these in Maine. They go in marinas and around public docks and help remove a lot of the plastic that's floating there on the surface, usually larger plastics. Down here in the bottom left-hand corner is the U-design buoy, and that passively samples or collects microplastics from the water column. These are actions that we can implement at home to help support plastic reduction. There's the Cora ball that you put in your washing machine, and that sort of traps a lot of those microfibers before they get put out in your outtake water. The Guppy Friend, which you can buy through directly from Guppy Friend, or Patagonia also sells them. It's a very fine mesh bag. It is plastic, but it's a recyclable plastic that is very robust, and you can put your synthetic clothing in there and wash it, and that helps reduce the microfiber shedding into your water. But probably the most effective is this Filtrol. It's a Canadian company that makes this, or it's also called a lint lover. And this, you can manually put this into your outtake on your washing machine, and it's very similar to your dryer, the thing that you have in your dryer to collect lint, but there's a bag that you can then remove the lint from every few washes. So all of these are things that you can do to help support, but ultimately it's our awareness of the threat of plastic pollution and our actions as constituents and consumers that will help us create a future free of plastic pollution. So I feel that there is sufficient scientific evidence to begin mitigation now for preventing future sources of plastic pollution. And as a scientist, I think that continuing to study the population level health effects of plastic interaction with humans and animals is important, but we need to operate under and implement the precautionary principle. Fortunately, there's growing awareness in many government organizations and in the general populace of plastic pollution as a threat to our health and the ecosystem. International agreements and national action plans should provide the foundational support for local investigations that lead to implementation of science-informed actions relevant to each region. And much of my research shows the importance of local sampling campaigns to inform solutions on the ground and feed into global databases to better understand the issue on a larger scale. For plastic pollution, we need to think globally, collaborate globally, regionally and nationally, and act locally. So thank you for listening, and I am happy to take any questions. That went a little faster than I thought, so we have plenty of time for questions now.
Great.
So can you hear
Oh,
me?
wait, excuse me. I'm going to read the questions in the chat first, and then I'll ask people in the audience to unmute, okay?
Thank you.
So I have a question here, Abby, from Dick. He says, dryer screens have much more fiber from natural clothing than artificial. How much worse are plastic fibers compared to cotton wool etc. Also, have the fleece makers like Patagonia had anything to say about this?
All right, there's a bunch of questions rolled into one, and these are all things I've thought a lot about. So the reason plastic fibers are a little bit more insidious is because of their longevity and ability to transport into all of these different habitats that I spoke about. Also, 50% of plastics are made with hazardous materials. And so there's that component of that leaching out over time. That said, a lot of cotton wool natural fibers are also treated with a lot of sort of nasty dyes and chemicals to give them some of the properties that we enjoy. But I would say on the whole, we know that plastics just persist in our environment a lot longer. So they are much more sort of a concern. For the natural fibers, they will break down more quickly over time, releasing some of those dyes and chemicals that they were made with, but at least they will not be causing issues with when they're ingested in terms of entanglement and blockages in the digestive system of animals. So Patagonia, I've worked quite closely with them a lot, and they actually were some of the first people to do some of the shedding studies looking at their clothing, and they have been on the forefront of trying to use material engineering to create more robust and less shedding fibers. So they've definitely been the first to be like, hey, we're part of the issue here. So I'm not sure what their latest update is on their sort of standardization for creating those fibers. There's been a lot of talk of sharing some of those trade secrets across the board for the betterment of the environment. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, and Patagonia is one of the better companies out there making polar fleece, right? Or trying to be conscious of it, trying to be conscious of it.
Yeah.
So there's one more question in the chat that I don't understand. Robin, could you unmute yourself and ask your question, please? Thank you.
Sure. It was the very first slide that you showed that showed the United States, and the title said that we were responsible for anywhere up to 1.4, I think, million metric tons of the microplastic waste. But then all the other numbers just said metric tons. And so I wasn't sure whether the million in the top was wrong or whether all the other sections were also in millions of metric tons.
That's in millions of metric tons. They're just abbreviating million metric tons with just MT. It's a little confusing because my previous slide, actually, it doesn't have that abbreviation. But yeah, so that's all millions of metric tons.
Thank you.
And that's a open source paper that you can download from the internet. I think it's called, it's a clever name, but you can look up United States plastic waste, and Law is the last name of the author. That's has a lot of depressing but interesting facts on plastic waste.
Thank you.
Okay, so more questions are coming into the chat. Here's one. Were your samples collected from the surface or at different depths? I'm interested in your filtering technique. What size pore was the filter, and did you use a vacuum pump? I don't know. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. The first question. So yes, the published study was just looking at. I did side by side. The first study that I did in Blue Hill Bay was a side-by-side comparison of looking at surface waters only. I have done some sampling at depth using Niskin bottles, and that was pretty interesting. I never published that data, but there's definitely plenty of plastic suspended throughout the water column. Also with Adventure Scientists, I had a lot of different adventurers, and so I had scuba divers also take samples at depth. And I worked with National Geographic when they were helping set up a marine protected area in Palau, and with the Pristine Seas Project, and they took concurrent surface samples and samples at depth using snorkeling. And actually almost all of those, the samples at depth contained more plastic than the surface samples. I didn't incorporate the surface, the depth samples into the global publication because I only had a handful. I also had quite a few depth samples from Alaska, And they also, throughout the water column, there was, a diverse range of plastics, but definitely plenty of plastics throughout the water column. And in terms of aquatic environments, the water column is definitely the least studied. So I hope that answers that section of the question. And the filtering technique is it's pretty straightforward. Using glass filtration. I used a 0.45 micron gridded filter. So with a mixed cellulose ester there. So since it was such tiny pore size, I vacuum pumped them over the filter. And sometimes if there's a lot of sediment or other things in the water sample or plastics, I would have to filter the sample over multiple filters.
Okay. So there's a question here from Stephen. He asks, is any microplastic research planned for the Penobscot Bay, and could there be?
There certainly could be. Not that I know of. I did also, when I was working for the Shaw Institute 8 years ago now, or 6 years ago now, I did do some research, random sampling throughout Stonington and Penobscot Bay, off of Stonington Harbor, trying to, this was early days, really trying to see if areas with high lobster gear had higher amounts of high density lobster gear, had higher amounts of microplastics. I also did sampling of freshwater inputs in Stonington Harbor and at the wastewater treatment outfall. Off the top of my head, I can't remember all of those results, but there were fairly high amounts of plastic. At this point, I'm not sure what the Shaw Institute is doing in terms of its monitoring, but I know that they did go on to do more research on commercial seafood and do general microplastics monitoring. But that's something you could check out on the website. But other than them, I am not aware of any sort of widespread research that's being undertaken in the coming seasons.
Okay, thank you for that. Linda asks, how can we improve our water? Just a general question. I don't know if she means her drinking water, or I think that could possibly be what she's meaning.
Our drinking water, well, a lot of us are on well water, but we do know microplastics is in groundwater. You can do more filtration in your own house, but the difficult thing is that we are breathing it in. So, it's nice to think about where we could reduce our intake of plastic, but it's airborne. So we do know, this water glass that I've been sipping off of throughout this presentation, I'm sure has some airborne microplastics in it. So just thinking about ways to reduce plastic in your own house could help you reduce the plastic that you are breathing in or ingesting, indirectly through it landing on food and things like that. But I think clean water is so important. So I'm thinking about using a smaller micron filter for your home water is a way forward.
Okay, thanks. What are some ways we can prevent our clothes from shedding fibers in the wash or dryer?
Other than washing them less, some of those, that slide I showed with some of those home use things are helpful. So the Cora ball or the Guppy Friend bag, I personally really try to reduce. I look at, in the supermarket, I look at what's in my food. If I go clothes shopping, which I haven't done in quite a long time, I look at the material that the clothes is made out of, and I really try to gravitate towards natural fibers as much as possible. So that is lifestyle changes you can make as well. But there are those things that you can put in your washing machine. In terms of the dryer, there's really not, there hasn't been anything developed to reduce the microfibers released from your dryer. The Filtrol system, I think, is probably the best, has the highest recovery rate for microplastics based on the lab studies done on those.
Yeah, you can always not put your polar fleece in the dryer. That could work. So here's a question from someone. Documentaries on the plastic problem indicate that the petroleum companies are planning to triple their plastic production by 2050. Are there any ways to prevent this?
Yeah, it's pretty concerning. Here in the US, we're building a lot of new petrochemical factories in Texas, and Africa and Asia have been sort of tapped for being the next major areas of the world for flooding with plastic, single-use plastic in particular. I think being switched on as a voting constituent in Maine is really important. I think talking to your legislators about it. I know that's Maine-based, but then bugging our senators for having a plastic-free presidency. There's been a lot of movement afoot to try to really push some strong bills as Biden goes into office. So I think just being switched on to what's going on and figure out ways to help support that, even if it's just signing petitions and talking to people about it.
All right. Well, also sort of along those lines in a way, you mentioned that 18 of the 19 tested samples of bottled water contained microplastic. Out of curiosity, which brand was found to exclude microplastics? I figured somebody was going to ask this one. Tell us all.
Yeah, and I'm really trying to. I mean, this was years ago that I did this study. I'm really trying to remember which one it was, and I sort of feel like it was a fluke. It might have been Dasani. But I actually can't remember. Maybe there's a mental block there because I don't want to promote any bottled water. Yeah, I think it might have been Dasani, which maybe if I had 3 more bottles of Dasani, that wouldn't have been the case.
Yeah. All right. Thanks. So Susan asked a question. Did the plastics at greater depth contain more adhered chemicals? I'm trying to pull together a short investigative research class at the Hutchinson Center in Belfast this summer to look at microplastics in the Belfast Bay.
That's a great question. And unfortunately, the scope of my research didn't encompass toxicology for those plastics. I do have a few thousand samples in my basement, and since those are legacy compounds, they probably aren't breaking down at all. So if you want to look at any of those samples, most of these are surface samples. I might be able to dig up some of the depth ones, and you have the laboratory machinery to do chemical analysis. You'd be welcome to them. But overall, thinking about other studies, I don't know if there has been one area of the ocean that seems to contain more persistent organic pollutants or toxicants. The beach sand, nurdles found in beach sand, that's what I said, 1 million magnitudes higher than the surrounding seawater. There's a International Pellet Watch, which is a study done out of Japan, and Takada, the fellow that heads that up, did a lot of looking at sort of the absorbed chemicals onto the plastic and seeing levels of toxicants, and that was really shocking to see those. So, but those, they just travel around. Those have traveled maybe all over the ocean, being on the surface for a while, and then they get covered in algae and sink lower into the water column, maybe get eaten by something, and then pooped out, and then float back up to the surface. It's probably a pretty wild ride that a lot of these plastics undergo, and have a lot of opportunity to pick up everything that we've put into the environment.
I think there's a typo in the next question. I'm going to assume this person means farmed oysters. Can farmed oysters provide filtering of microplastics? And if yes, does that hurt them for being edible? That's part 1 of the question. Then this person asks if city water treatment filters do filter the microplastics.
Okay, the oyster question is near and dear to my heart, clearly. And we know that bivalves are filter feeders, and they definitely filter and can ingest some microplastics. We also see that they also egest, so sort of take it into their mantle, pass it over their cilia, and poop it back out as pseudofeces, basically reject it. So we know that they can do some sorting, particularly of spherical plastics. They often reject. That's the same for mussels and other filter feeders. They certainly are ingesting some plastics, but I don't think they've been, it seems that they don't retain it for very long, that it does actually move back out of their body. Again, there's more research needs to be done on that. And a lot of these are laboratory studies, not using environmentally relevant levels of microplastics. So they're, pumping the water full of plastic, and then looking how the animal reacts to that. We know oysters and other animals, oysters can filter up to 50 gallons of water in a day. They're great for remediation. You wouldn't probably want to bite into one after that, but such as in Long Island Sound, the Billion Oyster Project, they're using to clean up Long Island Sound. So that's definitely could be a way, but again, what do you do? How to optimize how much plastic they're ingesting, and what would you then remove the animal? So they haven't been talked about as a way to sequester plastics, but more to filter out other impurities in the water. I hope that answers your question. And the second part, water
treatment plants.
Water treatment plants. Unfortunately, water treatment plants are so diverse, and here in the US we have every system you can imagine under the sun. So water treatment plants have been shown to capture some levels of microplastic, especially more of those spherical and larger pieces. So they can act as a sink for microplastics, but they also are seen as a source, because a lot of thousands of gallons, especially in cities, are going through the wastewater treatment plants, and a lot of those microfibers in particular are not captured in the mesh sizes that they have. It's just too hard to have something, the diameter of a microfiber can be 10 microns, so tiny. So a lot of wastewater treatment plants and water treatment plants are actually retaining microplastics, but also pumping them into the environment, if that makes sense. The other piece of that, of the microplastics that are retained, are often in the sludge or in something that will be removed from the wastewater treatment plant and then spread, as I said in my presentation, over land. Like here in Stonington, they spray it over land, and that's another way that these microplastics and microfibers are directly entering our environment. So it's a little grim, but there are the wastewater treatment plants that have the tertiary, 3 different sort of settlement tanks and filtration systems seem to retain very high levels of plastic, even though quite a lot still get through. So it's sort of an unsatisfying answer, but that's sort of that's the reality of our treatment plants. Pre the current administration, I was working a lot with the EPA and trying to figure out if there were ways that we could either retrofit or for new wastewater treatment plants that were being built, figure out ways to better capture microplastics. But over the last 4 years, obviously none of that stuff moved forward. And most of my friends at the EPA moved on, but I'd be interested to see if some of that gets picked back up, because that's a great point source of pollution that's very tangible and already monitored, that we could make some changes in.
All right, well, here for the last question, I think that people are feeling despair. And in your opinion, what's the most important thing we can do to stop this problem? Should we put pressure on manufacturers, encourage policymakers? I mean, I think you've kind of touched on all of this, but I think sounds like they need a pep talk.
Yeah, I mean, nothing's going to change unless we as consumers vote with our dollar, get involved with local legislation. I think policy and upstream policy is really going to be the change for the future. Helping support some of this extended producer responsibility, zero waste, trying to help companies and businesses that have plastics within plastic awareness and plastic pollution within their sort of, what's the word? Within their mission statement is, supporting organizations and companies that are aware of that. But yeah, I think that regulation and awareness of those, having the producers be more responsible for what they're producing, and putting into our waste system is really one major way forward.
All right, well, that was the last question in the chat, and we're just about out of time. I don't know if you have anything else to say, Abby. I mean, also legislation, I mean, I think that's important too, to support your legislators.
Absolutely, yeah, and I did touch on it a little bit, but there are some bills coming up to watch. And then Natural Resource Council of Maine has been working on a bill that would be helping to reduce plastic pollution. Actually, Genevieve McDonald, my local rep, is working on a bill to stop balloon releases, which it's the 21st century. I can't believe that they're not illegal, just releasing balloons into the environment. So it's those awareness pieces that are really important in getting people to move the needle on plastic pollution.
All right, well, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And with that, I'm going to stop recording. And